The wind came first, soft at the edges, like a whisper unsure of itself, then stronger, dragging threads of dust across the empty street until they curled around the hem of her dress, as if trying to claim it. Clara Belle Whitmore stood alone beneath a sky the color of fading gold, her veil caught on a splinter of the church railing, fluttering weakly behind her like something that had already given up. The church doors creaked once more, a tired sound, as though even the wood pitied her. But no one came out this time. No Hitty the Paligi. No Brislis explanation. No Henry. Only silence. Some heartbreaks arrive like thunder, loud and unforgiving. Hers came quietly in front of everyone. A few townsfolk lingered across the street, pretending to busy themselves with nothing at all. Their voices carried on the wind, low, careful, but not careful enough. He left her standing there, didn't even show his face. Poor thing. Or maybe she knew all along. Clara didn't turn toward them. She couldn't. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers brushing against lace that no longer felt like it belonged to her. It clung to her skin in the heat, heavy and suffocating, as though it too was ashamed to be seen. Inside her mind, the moment replayed, not in sharp clarity, but in fragments. The empty aisle, the shifting weight of guests growing restless, the preacher clearing his throat one too many times, her father's silence beside her, thicker than any words he might have spoken, and the door, always the door. She had watched it as if her entire life depended on it opening. It never did. One by one, the guests had slipped away. Some offered soft condolences as they passed, their eyes avoiding hers. Others didn't bother at all. The women whispered behind gloved hands. The men shook their heads like this was some inevitable tragedy, one they'd expected all along. Her father had been the last to leave. He didn't say a word. Not when he stepped down from the altar. Not when he brushed past her shoulder. Not even when she turned slightly, hoping, just once, that he might stop. He didn't. And so she had walked out of the church alone, her steps slow at first, then steadier, as if the weight of staying had finally become heavier than the act of leaving. Now the town stretched before her, wide and unfamiliar in a way it had never been before. The same buildings stood where they always had. The same dusty road ran through its center. But something had shifted, something quiet and final. There was no place left for her here. Clara drew in a breath that tasted like sun-warmed dirt and swallowed whatever was rising in her throat. She stepped forward, her shoes scuffing against the ground, already worn thin from a journey she hadn't planned to take. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. The sun dipped lower as she walked, shadows stretching long and thin across the earth. Her veil tore free from the railing somewhere behind her, but she didn't notice. Or perhaps she did, and simply didn't care enough to turn back. Each step felt both too heavy and too light, like she might collapse under the weight of it all, or disappear entirely if she didn't keep moving. Time blurred. At some point, the town faded behind her, its whispers swallowed by distance. The road narrowed, then thinned, until it was little more than a suggestion carved into dry land. The air cooled slightly, brushing against her flushed skin with a gentleness she hadn't felt all day. She found herself near an old well just outside the edge of nowhere, a place long forgotten, its wood worn gray and splintered by years of neglect. Clara sank down beside it, her dress pooling around her like spilled milk gone to dust. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't think, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she brought her hands to her face, not to hide, but to feel something real. Her fingers pressed against her cheeks, tracing the salt of tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, though there was no one there to hear it. The question hung in the air, unanswered. It wasn't just about direction. It was something deeper, something more fragile. A question of worth, of belonging, of whether there was still a place in this world for someone who had just been so thoroughly left behind. The sound of hooves came faintly at first, distant enough that she might have imagined it. But it grew steadier, more certain, until it settled into the rhythm of something real. Clara didn't look up immediately. She wasn't ready to be seen. The rider slowed as he approached, the horse's steps softening against the earth. He didn't rush forward, didn't call out. He simply stopped a few paces away, as though understanding that anything sudden might shatter what little remained of her. Elias Boone had seen many things in his life, storms that swallowed entire fields, winters that carved hunger into the bones of men. But there was something about the sight before him that made him still in a different way. A bride, alone in the dust. He removed his hat, not out of habit, but out of something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Not of her, but of the kind of pain that didn't need explaining. For a while, he said nothing. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint rustle of her dress, the slow exhale of his horse. It might have been minutes. It might have been longer. Finally, his voice came low, steady and unhurried. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Clara lifted her head then, just enough to see him. He wasn't what she expected. There was no sharpness in his gaze, no curiosity dressed as concern. Just a kind of stillness, like a man who had learned not to ask questions he didn't need answers to. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she considered lying, saying yes, pretending she had somewhere, anywhere, that might take her in. But the truth was heavier than pride. She hadn't realized had fallen. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, though there was no one there to hear it. The question hung in the air, unanswered. It wasn't just about direction. It was something deeper, something more fragile. A question of worth, of belonging, of whether there was still a place in this world for someone who had just been so thoroughly left behind. The sound of hooves came faintly at first, distant enough that she might have imagined it. But it grew steadier, more certain, until it settled into the rhythm of something real. Claire didn't look up immediately. She wasn't ready to be seen. The rider slowed as he approached, the horse's steps softening against the earth. He didn't rush forward, didn't call out. He simply stopped a few paces away, as though understanding that anything sudden might shatter what little remained of her. Elias Boone had seen many things in his life, storms that swallowed entire fields, winters that carved hunger into the bones of men. But there was something about the sight before him that made him still in a different way. A bride, alone in the dust. He removed his hat, not out of habit, but out of something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Not of her, but of the kind of pain that didn't need explaining. For a while, he said nothing. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint rustle of her dress, the slow exhale of his horse. It might have been minutes. It might have been longer. Finally, his voice came low, steady and unhurried. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Clara lifted her head then, just enough to see him. He wasn't what she expected. There was no sharpness in his gaze, no curiosity dressed as concern. Just a kind of stillness, like a man who had learned not to ask questions he didn't need answers to. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she considered lying, saying yes, pretending she had somewhere, anywhere, that might take her in. But the truth was heavier than pride. Elias dismounted first, offering a hand without looking directly at her, as though giving her the choice to take it or not. She did. His grip was steady, careful. He didn't linger. Inside, the house was simple, clean, but bare in places. The kind of space that had known both use and absence. He led her down a short hallway and opened a door. "There's water," he said quietly, "and food on the table." That was all. No instructions. No expectations. Just room. Clara stepped inside, her movements slow, uncertain. The bed sat neatly in the corner, a folded blanket resting at its edge. A small basin of water caught the faint glow of lamplight. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the bed as if testing whether it was real. Behind her, Elias had already turned away. The door closed softly, and in the quiet that followed, something inside her finally gave way. Not in a loud, breaking kind of way, but in a slow unraveling. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and steady, as she sank onto the edge of the bed. Her shoulders shook with the effort of holding everything in for too long. She pressed her hands to her face again, but this time it wasn't to hide. It was to feel, to remind herself that she was still here, still breathing, still something, The lace of her dress crumpled beneath her fingers, no longer a symbol of what had been promised, but of what had been survived. And for the first time since the church bells rang that morning, she wasn't standing alone. Morning arrived gently, as though it feared disturbing what little peace had settled in the night. Clara woke to the quiet creak of wood and the distant rhythm of work already begun. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The bed beneath her felt unfamiliar, the air too still, too kind. Then memory returned, not all at once, but in soft fragments. The church, the dust, the question, "Do you have anywhere to go?" She sat up slowly, her body heavy but no longer hollow. The dress she still wore lay wrinkled around her, its lace dulled by yesterday's sorrow. For a long moment, she looked at it, not with shame this time, but with a quiet understanding. Then she rose. Outside, the world stretched open in shades of gold and pale blue. The ranch moved with a quiet rhythm, untouched by the noise of town or the weight of watching eyes. Elias stood near the fence, mending a broken post, his movements steady, deliberate, like a man who trusted time more than words. He glanced up when he heard the door, but said nothing. Neither did she, and somehow that felt right. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, like pages turned by a careful hand. Clara began to find small places to belong, not in grand gestures, but in the unnoticed spaces between them. She swept the floors that gathered dust no matter how often they were cleaned. She folded linens that smelled faintly of sun. She mended a torn sleeve she found draped over a chair, her stitches uneven at first, then steadier with time. Elias never asked her to do these things, and she never asked if she should. It became a language of its own, this quiet exchange of care. One morning, she struggled with a stubborn chair leg that refused to sit evenly. She pressed against it with growing frustration, her hands slipping against worn wood. Without a word, Elias passed by, paused, and crouched beside it. With a few simple adjustments, he steadied the leg, setting it firm against the ground. He didn't look at her when he stood. Later that day, he found fresh bread resting near his tools, still warm, the crust imperfect but honest. He didn't thank her, but the next morning, he left a second cup beside hers at the table. It was enough. Yet the world beyond the ranch had not forgotten her. When Clara returned to town for supplies, the air shifted the moment she stepped onto the street. Conversations quieted, not entirely, but just enough to make her aware of them. Eyes followed her, some curious, others sharp with judgment that had not dulled with time. "She's still wearing that look," someone muttered. "Ran off with that Boone man, didn't she?" No decent woman would stay under a stranger's roof. The words didn't strike as sharply as they once had, but they lingered like dust settling into fabric. At the general store, a woman she once knew, Mrs. Hargrove, tilted her head with thinly veiled pity. "You always were too hopeful, Clara," she said softly. "This situation suits you less than the dress did." Clara held her gaze for a moment longer than she would have before. Then she turned away, but the walk back felt longer, heavier. By the time she reached the ranch, something inside her had begun to tighten again, that old familiar feeling creeping in at the edges. Shame, doubt, the quiet voice that asked if perhaps the town was right. That night, she packed her things. There wasn't much to gather. The dress, the borrowed coat, a few small pieces of herself she hadn't yet lost. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace of the house. The door stood just ahead, the night beyond it waiting like an open question. Her hand rested on the handle. "You leaving?" Elias's voice came from behind her, low and steady. She froze. For a moment, she considered pretending otherwise. But something about the way he stood, unmoving, not accusing, made the truth feel easier than the lie. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "The town, they talk. They always will. I won't have you carry that." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. Elias stepped forward, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough to be heard without raising his voice. "You don't have to run from ghosts that ain't yours." The words settled slowly, like rain on dry ground. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her fingers tightening slightly on the handle. "They don't see it that way," she whispered. "And maybe they're not wrong." Another pause. Then Elias moved past her, opening the door. Not to let her leave, but to step outside. "Come on," he said. She hesitated, then followed. The night air wrapped around them, cool and still. He led her a short distance behind the house, to a place she hadn't yet seen. The ground there was different, carefully tended, the earth smoothed in a way that spoke of quiet attention. Two small wooden markers stood side by side. Clara's breath caught. Elias stood a few steps away, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the space before him. "My wife," he said, after a long while. "And our boy." There was no tremor in his voice, no breaking, just truth, laid bare without decoration. "Lost him in winter," he continued. "Fever took hold. Didn't let go." Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. "I stayed quiet after that," he said. Seemed easier than trying to explain something folks wouldn't understand anyway. His eyes shifted then, not fully meeting hers, but close. "People talk," he added simply. "That's what they do when they ain't got the weight of real things to carry." The words weren't bitter, just worn. Clara stepped closer, her gaze resting on the markers. She didn't reach out, not to touch them, not to touch him. But something inside her shifted, something subtle and profound. For the first time, she understood the silence he carried. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone in hers. They stood there together for a long while, saying nothing. But the quiet had changed. In the days that followed, Clara didn't leave. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she was beginning to choose where she stayed. The next time she rode into town, the whispers came again, but they didn't land the same way. They brushed against her, but did not settle. When Mrs. Hargrove spoke, her tone just as sharp beneath its softness, Clara didn't turn away. "I wore that dress for someone who didn't come," she said, her voice calm, steady. "I'm not wearing it for you." The woman blinked, caught off guard. And for the first time, the silence that followed belonged to Clara. Elias stood nearby, not stepping in, not speaking on her behalf, just present. It was enough. When they returned to the ranch, the air felt lighter somehow, as if something unseen had finally loosened its grip. Time moved forward, quiet and sure. Elias built a small addition to the house, not all at once, but piece by piece. Clara didn't ask why. She simply watched as the space slowly took shape. In the yard, she planted seeds in the dry soil, her hands pressing gently into the earth as though asking it to trust her. Most didn't take, but some did. One evening, as the sun slipped low across the horizon, they sat side by side on the porch. The sky stretched wide before them, painted in colors too soft to name. Neither spoke. Their hands rested near each other on the worn wood between them. Not touching. Not quite. Then, slowly, almost uncertainly, her fingers shifted, and has met them halfway. There was no rush. No sudden grasp. Just contact. Warm. Steady. Real. Clara exhaled, a quiet breath that carried something new within it. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Peace, perhaps. Or maybe simply the beginning of belonging. The world beyond them still whispered. It always would. But here, in this small space carved out of quiet understanding, those voices no longer decided who she was. And maybe they never had. Sometimes, life does not return what it once promised. It does not mend itself in the shape we expected, nor does it apologize for the ways it breaks us open. But if you're still, and you listen closely, you might find something else waiting in the silence. Not louder, not brighter, but steadier, at a place where you are not chosen because you were perfect, but because you stayed, because you endured, because you learned, slowly, to see yourself as someone worth keeping. So if you ever find yourself standing in the dust of something that didn't come to pass, wondering where you're meant to go next, remember this. Sometimes, the question is not where you belong, but who is willing to stand beside you, until you finally believe that you do.